facilitate this. This led to tight credit policies, tight monetary policies, and one way of mitigating the unemployment that was being generated in West Europe was to dump consumer goods from West Europe into the former Soviet Union and Soviet bloc. And in fact, what we saw was this great reversal in terms of trade from the late 1980s to the early 1990s, whereas much of the former Soviet bloc had great trade exports with the West. This was reversed by the early 1990s. And this very much also served the interests of especially Germany and France. And the idea of a strong Latvian currency and strong currencies in the former Soviet bloc generally served their interests, so that these nations could buy their imports. Now, what we saw further with this Georgetown gang, to return to this group, that actually put these policies in place, they established a set of meetings in 1991 and 1992 at the seaside resort of Yurmala. Gorbachev, in fact, once in the 1980s, when he was accused of being an agent for the Soviet Union, denied the charge, but declared that if he was going to be one, he certainly would have demanded a doctorate in Yurmala. It's a nice place to meet. They convened about 8 meetings, and they put together this plan called Latvia 2000. And in Latvia 2000, again, they solidified these policies of, again, having a strong currency, and of course, no industrial policy, not reorganizing agriculture, just letting the market do what it will. Now, the students of the Georgetown gang, of Juris Viksnīš, would be people like Ainars Repša, would be people like Mr. Rimšēvics, who has been at the Bank of Latvia, in other words, Latvia's central bank, since 1992. Mr. Repša has been in and out of the central bank since that time as well. He's also been the prime minister. He's also been the country's finance minister. And even though the Latvians have changed governments on a Italian-like my apologies to Salvatore, schedule every year or so, there has been great consistency in terms of the country's finance policies established and maintained by the Bank of Latvia. So these students of the Georgetown gang have been running the show for the last 20 years, and they've been absolutely resolute in defending the policies which have led to the current crisis. The country has been in a state of almost perpetual crisis for 20 years, but as a bow to my colleague here on the left, Henwood, of course, the term crisis loses its meaning if we see it as being perpetual. So I don't know how long they can continue to exist in this rather chaotic state of affairs. But we have seen several major financial collapses over the past 20 years. We have seen the country again be used as this finance offshore platform. We've seen nefarious figures such as the notorious Lucy Edwards, who was featured quite regularly in the New York Times about 10 years ago for running all of these wild offshore financial schemes all over the world, cooperating rather extensively with banks such as Pavex in Latvia. And in fact, in the late 1990s, they used to run seminars there quite openly. It cost you $10,000 to attend, and they showed you how to set up these offshore financial operations there. So we've seen Latvia be really at the epicenter of these developments in the global economy that have led to these highly destructive, unregulated capital flows, tax evasion. A good friend of mine, I don't always keep this bad of company, but a young Latvian American graduate of Mount Holyoke, somebody who is very practical minded, very smart, but doesn't think too much about the effects of her work, runs one of these operations. They're everywhere. They can be either small retail-based operations, street-level operations, to very large operations as well, run by the largest banks. We have a country of again, 2.3 million people that has roughly 25 banks. Latvia does not need this many banks, of course. to handle the credit needs of its own economy. It's because they're largely serving this function as providing these offshore instruments to both its own businesses and those throughout the former Soviet Union. Where do we see ourselves today? Well, thank you. Again, after 20 years of almost perpetual crisis, we finally have reached a point where the Latvians are beginning to question the effectiveness of this neoliberal paradigm that was imparted by the Georgetown gang in 1991 and 1992. The central bank has still not given up on it, but we do see the possibility of some of the political parties in the country demanding some change in economic policy. Again, unfortunately, there's not as much demand for change coming from below as we would like to see because everyone is leaving the country, but nonetheless the crisis is sufficiently deep that those who have remained behind are certainly asking for some change. The biggest steps that need to be undertaken are to, one, introduce some kind of industrial policy, two, radically alter the tax policies that were put in place in the early 1990s. Very high taxes on labor, no taxes on capital goods, and a very, very low tax on corporate income. These taxes have made Latvia's labor uncompetitive when combined with its very strong currency, and they have encouraged this gross speculation in real estate, which goes well beyond anything that we've seen in the United States. My colleague Michael Hudson and myself, as early as 1995, were advising the Latvian government to do something about this imbalance in tax policy. But since the people we were advising were all thoroughly in the real estate market themselves, having privileged access to the country's municipal maps and where the new roads were going to be coming in and all the rest, had no interest in actually implementing these policies. But now we're beginning to see some prospect for a possible change and the development of a new set of economic policies. The last thing that I would note is that we are also beginning to see some interest in developing the agricultural sector as well, something that again has been completely ignored to date. Latvia has historically been a major producer of grains, and we're hoping that it may return to that place in the global economy as providing that niche as a wheat producer again. So, with that brief historical overview, I'm going to turn the podium over to Mark Weisbrot, who is going to speak next. Mark, that's what we agreed in your absence. It was easy to do since we didn't have to consider your needs. We made an executive level decision. And Mark is going to, I believe, speak more on the situation not only in Latvia but in Greece and the pigs generally. But he'll tell us specifically what he plans to address. Thank you.